In this video, I'll show you how to make a simple web app, specifically a gradebook that's similar to the one I use in my classroom. To get started, go to drive.google.com and click New. We're going to create a spreadsheet, and once it loads, change the name to Gradebook, and we'll call this version 1. Alright. The next step is to populate our gradebook with some data. I'm going to go ahead and create a column here for users, and I'm going to make myself a user so that I can test it as I'm making it. I recommend you do the same. And I'm going to also use my another account here that I can test it out with. I need to have an account that is not the same as the account that is being used to create this web app, because I want to make sure that it's accessible to my students. In order to test that, I need to make sure that it's accessible to an account that is not the owner of the spreadsheet. Next, I'm going to create some assignments here, and let's see, rules, quiz. These are actual assignments I use with my students in my class, and I'm going to put some scores in here as well. So the welcome letter, I usually make that worth 5 points, and I'll say that both of these students got their points for that. The rules quiz is out of 10 points, and I'll say that I scored a perfect 10, but this user here only scored an 8. And then the 1-2-3D circuits intro assignment, I'll say this user completed it, which is worth 25 points, and this user did not. They just got 0. Now, to make the programming a little bit easier, I'm going to get rid of all of the rows I do not need. In order to do that, I'm going to click on the first row that I don't need, and then hold Control and Shift down, and then arrow down. Then I'm going to right click on that and hit Delete Rows. Over here, I'm going to do something very similar. I'm going to click on the first column I don't need, and then hold Control and Shift, and for Mac users that'll be Command and Shift, and then I'm going to use my right arrow key and highlight all the way to the end of the spreadsheet, right click on it and hit Delete Columns. Once I've done that, I'm going to do a few more things to make my job easier. First, I'm going to click on this column for users, and I'm going to name it. So I go to Data, Named Ranges, and I'm going to name this Users. Done. Then I'm going to click on the column here for the assignments, and I'm going to add a range called Assignments. Done. So I've got two named ranges, the assignments range and the users range. I'm also going to rename this sheet to something that makes a little bit more sense. I'll call it Gradebook. Okay. Once I have those things, it's time to start working on the script. To begin, click on Tools and then Script Editor. Once the script editor loads, let's go ahead and rename the script to Gradebook. This is what students will see when they are prompted for permissions when they go to access the gradebook for the first time. Click OK, and then we're going to change the name of this function to doGet, which is a special function that is called when somebody tries to follow the URL to this web app. I'm going to return HTML service dot create template from file, and then the file's name is index. We haven't created it yet, but we will here in just a minute. And then dot evaluate dot set sandbox mode, and then that will be HTML service dot sandbox mode dot iframe. My students ask me what this line of code means. Basically, it means we're going to create a web page out of this index file here. When you write commands, you end them with a semicolon. I'm going to hit save on this file. And then I'm going to hit File, New HTML file. I'm going to name this one Index. It's important that this name matches that name exactly. If it's a lowercase I here, it needs to be a lowercase I there. Hit OK. And I'm going to create my first web app here, or your first web app, Hello World, a simple little message to display. I'm going to click Save. And now I have this web page to display. The only thing you're going to see when you view this web page is that part right there, the stuff in between the body tags, for those of you who are not familiar with HTML. To test this script out, we're going to go to Publish and then Deploy as Web App. I'm going to say first run of Gradebook web app. And for now, we're just going to let this execute as me, and only I will be the one that has access to it. I'm going to click deploy. And when I do this, I'll have actually two URLs that I can use. Here it says test web app for your latest code. If I click on that link, it opens up a new tab that ends with a DEV at the end, and you can see my web app working here. The Hello World has been displayed. Now, this link here takes me to my latest code. This URL right here takes me to the code that was last published. So I'm copying it by pressing Control-C. On a Mac it would be Command-C. And right up here I'm going to paste it with Control-V or Command-V. And if you notice, it ends with an EXEC at the end. And again, it displays the words Hello World. Now I'm emphasizing the EXEC versus the DEV, the developer ending, because when I make a change, if I click OK here, and I make a simple change to my apps, instead of saying Hello World, it says Hello Mike, and I save that, and I go to my developer link here and hit refresh, you can see the new code is reflected in what you see here. It's changed. But if I go over to the EXEC URL and hit refresh, it doesn't change. And that's because the EXEC, the execute URL, won't change until I publish the web app again. So I say deploy as web app, change the project version to a 2, and I'm going to say changed message on index file. There we go. Hit update. OK, and I can go back over to this and refresh it, and now I see that it has changed. So now that I have the ability to take hard-coded HTML and display it to a web page right here and right here, the next step is to take the information I have in this gradebook. Specifically, what I'd like to do is take the assignments column and then the column associated with whichever user is logged into my app. I'd like to display both of those columns to the user in a visually understandable way. So to do that, we're going to create another function inside our code.gs file. That function, we're going to name it function get grades for user. That's how we create functions. This curly brace is the start of it, and then this curly brace right here is the end of the function. The first thing I want to do is I want to get the email of the user. So I create a variable to store the email in, and I say session.getActiveUser.getEmail. Alright. After that, I want to create a reference to the spreadsheet that I'm going to get the data from. So I say var ss equals spreadsheet app.open by ID. Now, to get the ID for, let's end it with a semicolon real quick. To get the ID for that spreadsheet, the easiest thing to do is just to go to the spreadsheet and highlight the ID right there. And I'm going to hit Control C. On a Mac, you'd hit Command C. Go back to my script. I'm going to put an apostrophe. I'm going to paste it, and I'm going to put another apostrophe. So you can see right here I have a string of characters that represent the ID of that spreadsheet. So now I have a reference to the spreadsheet. I am next going to pull some ranges from that spreadsheet. I'm going to pull the users range. So I'm going to create a variable for users. And the command to get it, first of all, I have to refer to the spreadsheet. So because I have it SS here for spreadsheet, I'm going to put SS here, and then dot get range by name. And the name, if you recall, if I look over here, is users with a capital U. So I need to type it exactly the same way right here inside some either double quotes or an apostrophe. So users, and then I don't actually want the range, I want the values inside that range. So I'm going to say dot get values, and that with a semicolon. Next, I'm going to create a variable for the row that's associated with the user that I'm trying to get data for. The starting row is going to be 0, and we're going to keep incrementing this variable, this row variable, until we find the row that matches the user that signed in with this email. To do that, I'm going to create a while loop, and I'm going to say while the users, and then the row and the column here, while that's not equal to the email, I want to increment the value of row. And I need to put an opening curly brace here. I'll put a closing one there. This is the beginning of the while loop. That's the end of the while loop. I say row plus plus. Okay, so the plus plus just means take row and add one to it. Up here in this users row, bracket row, bracket 0 here notation, what this is saying is over here when we executed this command, the get range by name, get values command here, that created a two-dimensional array where there's a bunch of rows and a bunch of columns. Well, in our case, just a couple rows and a couple columns. But eventually, ideally, there would be many more. The rows represent information for each user, and the columns represent information for each assignment. We only have one column here. If we look back, it's this column right here, because we just wanted to get the user information right now. That 0 is because arrays are 0 indexed. So while we would think of this as the first column in this spreadsheet, when we execute this command right here and it creates the two-dimensional array, the information is stored in what you could call the 0th column. Again, the same thing happens with the row here. There's information in the 0th row, and that information would be equivalent to this information here in the first row of the spreadsheet. That's a little quirk that programming languages have, where they have a 0 indexed arrays. It's a little bit annoying at first. It catches me off guard every once in a while when I'm trying to debug some code, but after a while you get used to it. So the next step here is we're going to create a little bit of an error message in the event that somebody tries to access the web app, but we can't find them. This script runs and it doesn't find the user. So we're going to say if the row ends up equaling the users.length, then what we want to do is return a message that says something to the effect of student ID not found. And then usually I'll give them some sort of helpful information like, did you log in with your school account? If not, log out of any Google account and log in. Log in. Let's see here. Log in with your school account. Apostrophe here to end it, and then a semicolon to end the whole command. So now we have some sort of error message in the event that user is not found. The next step is to, we're going to increment the row just one time, and that is because after it gets done with this loop, it returns the correct row for the array, but not for the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet's rows are always going to be one above the arrays, so I have to add one to whatever we get from doing this procedure with the array that was created right here, so that when we use it with a spreadsheet, it's referring to the correct row. After that, and I'll just put a little note to myself here that says arrays are 0 indexed. That's why we have to do this. Alright. After that, let's go ahead and create a variable to store the HTML. The HTML is the code that is used to create web pages, and we're going to create a table inside of our web page. So I'm going to say table here. This is the table tag. If you're not familiar with this, I suggest going to Khan Academy and working through their HTML course. Then I'm going to say var. I'm going to create a new variable for the assignments that we have stored in our spreadsheet. I'm going to make that equal to ss dot, and I'm going to say get range by name. Just like I did up here, I got range by users. I'm going to get it by this time assignments, and I'm doing this because I named it that way over here. So when I go back to this, I have assignments, and then I'm going to say dot, again, get values. I'm not interested in the range, I'm interested in the values inside that range. Okay, next I'm going to say var gradebook. What I'm going to do here is grab a reference to the sheet. That's this whole sheet here that's named gradebook. I'm going to create a reference to it in my code by saying var gradebook equals spreadsheet.get sheet by name, and here I'm going to put gradebook. Again, I have to capitalize the G here because that's how I have it written right here. And then I don't need to put a dot there, I need a semicolon. Next I'm going to say var scores, and these are the scores for each assignment. And I'm going to say gradebook. Now I'm referring to this this creation right here, this variable right here. I'm using that to get a new range, get range, and I want to get the range that has the, I want to back up here and type that again, get range. If you look, there's lots of different commands here. I can go ahead and use this one here that says get range, integer row, integer column, integer number of rows, integer number of columns. So I have 4 different numbers that this command takes right here. The first one is what row do I want, the second one is which column do I want, and then how many rows beyond this row that I put over here do I want, and how many columns beyond this column do I want. Well, I only want one row, so the first number is going to be the row that I want. I'm using the variable that we found right here, up here. I'm putting that right here, and then I'm going to put the columns. Well, I'm going to start with the first column, and this command refers to spreadsheet notation. So when I put a 1 here, that's the 1th column. That's this column right here in the spreadsheet, the first column. I'm going to put comma, and now I'm going to put a 1 here because I only want one row. I don't need more than one row, just this single row for this user, and then comma, but I want to get all of the columns I can get because I want all of the assignments. So I'm going to put assignments, and then I'm going to put right here in brackets 0. So what I'm doing is I'm referring to this range right here that was created up here out of this right here. And if we look back at that, the assignments here is this part right here. It's got one row but 4 columns in it. And what I want to do is I want to figure out how many columns are in there. So I'm going to say in the 0th row, I want to know the length of that, dot length. So this should be 4 because the length of this row is 4 columns. Now I'm grabbing that data and I'm going to say dot get values again. I'm not interested in the reference to this range. I'm interested in the data inside of it. Semicolon. Now it's time to use a for loop to create some more HTML that we will serve on our web page. So I'm going to say for, and then var I equals 0. We're going to start with the 0th item in our array, and then we're going to go to len, that's going to be short for length, equals assignments, and then again I want to use the 0th row as my reference to figure out the length of the number of columns, so the length, how wide this range is. And then I'm going to put a semicolon right here. So I've created 2 variables that I'm going to use right here, and then I'm going to compare those 2 variables. I'm going to say while I is less than the length, the len here variable, which is the length of this row, how many columns wide it is. While that's true, I'm going to keep incrementing I. So I'm going to say I plus plus. I'm taking I and adding 1 to it every single time it goes through the for loop. Close it with a parenthesis, and then the magic happens right here. Oh, I need to start it with a curly brace. The magic happens right here. I say HTML plus equals. So whatever I had in this HTML variable, I'm adding to it. Plus equals, and for those of you who don't know HTML, I'm going to use some tags here. The TR tag is the table row tag, so I'm creating a row in my table, and then the TD tag is the table column tag, so I'm creating a column. And then next I'm going to put in the assignment here, assignment, and I want to get the information from the 0th row. So there's only one row in this assignments array, and we refer to that by the 0th row. And I want everything that's in it though. It's several columns wide, so I'm going to get everything that's in it by referring to I right here. So as we go through the for loop, the first time it'll get the 0th element, then the 1th element, then the first and second and third elements. And once I do that, I'm going to end that column by using some more tags here and start another column. And this column is going to have the scores in it. And the scores are going to be pulled again from the scores array is only 1 column tall, or 1 row tall, and it's however many columns wide. So we can refer to it as the 0th row and the ith column. and then we're going to close. We're going to end this column, and then we're going to end the row here. Again, for those of you who are not familiar with HTML, I highly recommend working through Khan Academy's HTML course. Codecademy has one as well. There's lots of resources on the web, but you do want to become familiar with what these tags mean here. For those of you who are new to JavaScript, this apostrophe here, this just indicates the beginning of a string, and then here we have the end of a string. So we're taking these HTML tags and we're adding them to whatever data is in here, and then we're adding them to whatever tag we need, and then adding them to some more data and to some more tags. So we're creating a table by putting all of this information together. We're going to end the for loop right there, and so right now it only has one row in this HTML table, but as it goes through the for loop, the first time it'll create one row, then it'll add another row, then it'll add another row, and then it'll add another row. It'll go through it 4 times because we have 4 columns right here. So once I'm done with my for loop, the next thing I'm going to do is type HTML plus equals, and then I'm going to close the table tag. There we go. And the last thing I'm going to do is return the HTML. So when this function is called, it's going to spit out this variable HTML right here that we started creating up here and we ended creating right here. Okay, I'm going to save that and go back to my, looks like I have some problems with my code here. If I look here, it says syntax error, line 11, file code. So if I look at line 11, I did something wrong, and that is I forgot to put what this is supposed to equal. And so while the user here does not equal the email that we captured right here, we want to go ahead and increment a row over and over and over again. So it's going to keep adding 1 to row until this condition is true. Alright, I'm going to hit save. And now it's time to go to our index file and start working on it. So what I'd like to do is when this function, or when this page first loads, I'm going to erase this here. I want to call that getGrades function. So I'm going to say onLoad equals google.script.run. And then I have to use what's called a callback function, a success handler. So I'm going to say with success handler, and then I'm going to say on get grades success, and then dot get grades for user. So that's definitely a mouthful here. Let's break down what's happening. This google.script.run says, okay, run a function that is in this code over here. So it's going to try and run this function right here, get grades for user. If we look, that's this function right here. Now, it does it asynchronously, which means it loads the page first and it kicks this off. Because this takes time, it has to send information out to the cloud and then wait for a reply. It renders the page, and then when that reply comes, it's going to execute this function right here. If we get success, if that function is actually called and it actually returns some information, it runs this function right here. Well, where is this function? We haven't created it yet. So I'm going to go back up to here. Inside the head, I'm going to create script tags. So whatever programming logic you have on a web page, you want to put them in between script tags. And inside here, I'm going to create a function called on get, in fact I can just copy this right here, on get grade success, and it's going to get some information. So this function executes, and remember this function returns some HTML. That's right here. It returns something, this information we created right here. So we can actually access that by creating a variable here called, we can call it whatever we want. I'm going to call mine grades table. You could call it Billy Bob Joe for all I care. It'll still work. And then we start the function right there. We're going to end it right here. And then the single line of code we're going to do is document dot get element by ID. And we need an element to get, so we don't have one yet. I'm going to put one right here called, we're going to create a div tag and then say ID equals output. And you can think of div tags as, a lot of times we just use them as placeholders. So I want to be able to refer to this div tag easily. So I'm giving it an ID right here, ID equals output, and then I can access it by going up here and putting an apostrophe output. So document get element by ID output, it's going to get this one right here. Looks like I did something wrong. Oh, I forgot to close the div tag correctly. It needs to have a /d right there. So this is the opening div tag, that's the closing div tag right there. Next, I'm going to put .inner HTML, and I'm going to set that equal to the grades table that we generated. So what's happening here is when I load the page, this script, this function is going to run. When it runs successfully, it's going to kick this function off, which is going to take the data that was given to us by this function and spit it right here. We're setting this element right here, this output element, we're setting it equal to the grades table. So it's going to put all of that information right in this spot in our web page, which is between the body tags, which basically, because this is the only thing that's there, that's what we're going to see. Now, to make it so that it works a little bit better, I'm going to put the words loading here so that when this page first loads, the user at least sees this. They're going to see loading. And so what that'll do is that'll tend to prevent them from clicking the refresh button a couple times, because sometimes it might take a second or two for this gradebook to load. And if that's the case, if they keep hitting refresh, it'll keep taking another second or two, and they'll think that it's broken. So if we put the word loading, they know, oh, I just got to wait a few seconds. And then when this happens and when that happens and finally replaces the word loading with the grades table, then they'll be able to see their grades. Okay, so if I go ahead and save this, and then I try testing it over here by hitting refresh. Uh-oh. Authorization is required to perform that action. What is going on? Let's try publishing this again, deploying it as a web app, and just go to new and say finished basic version of Gradebook. Update. Now here I'm getting a permissions request. Gradebook needs your permission to access your data on Google. I'm going to hit review permissions, and if you look, it wants to know who you are on Google, it wants to view your email address, and it wants to manage your spreadsheets in Google Drive. Well, it doesn't want to manage your spreadsheets, it actually wants to manage this spreadsheet. I'm going to scroll down and hit allow, and then hit OK. Now if I refresh this, it should work. And there we can see the data from this spreadsheet. Right here, you got my email, my scores, and the assignments. over here I have my assignments and my scores and of course my email. Now this doesn't look super pretty, so what I'm going to do is modify it slightly with a little bit of CSS. Personally, I hate using CSS because a lot of browsers don't render it the same way. Doesn't seem like it's real consistent from one browser to the next. But if you use just a little bit that's pretty standard, it tends to work okay. So the CSS I'm going to use is something to make the table and the rows in the table and the columns in the table, I want to give all of those borders. So I'm going to say border 1 px. I want to make them solid and I want to make it black. Then I want to put some padding on all of this stuff so that it's not right next to the borders aren't right next to my content, my grades and my assignments, and I'm just going to give it 5 pixels of padding. And the last thing I'm going to do is I want to make the second column centered. So I do that by saying first child here, and this is one of those examples of kind of the CSS that I hate. Some of this is kind of cryptic and it doesn't work on all browsers. It will work for many newer browsers. I want to center it. Close that, and if I save it now and then I refresh it, it should look a little prettier. Alright, so that looks like something that's fairly easy to read. If you think about what we've accomplished here, it's pretty amazing. We've taken some data from this spreadsheet, specific data, to the user who is accessing the web app, and we've displayed that data and that data alone to the user. So this here is quick and easy to update many students all at once, and then each student gets sort of a custom tailored view of how they're doing in the class. The next step is to test this so that it works for everyone. If I try this on another browser, let's see what happens. I'm going to copy, well, first of all, let's make sure that the executable side of it's working. Let's make sure that we actually published our changes, and see here the CSS did not get published. So let's go back to the script, click on publish, and then when we hit deploy as web app this time, we're going to make a few changes. We're going to call this one simple gradebook completed, published for all users. So I can't execute this script as me, because if I do, then it'll be the mb08353 at apps.matsuk12.us email that is recognized. We have to use this user accessing the web. Then when we run it, the email that it pulls from the user will be whoever's logged in. Down here where it says only myself, we can't restrict the web app to only myself. We have to make it so that anyone can see it. We could make it anyone within apps.matsuk12.us, but then if we have somebody that tries to log into it, but they're logged into maybe a Google account that's not part of my domain, they won't get a message that makes sense. So if we do it with anyone, that error message that we created earlier will be displayed. Now I'm going to hit update and OK. Now if I go over here and click refresh, this works. There's one more thing I need to do in order to make it so that the user who owns this web app is not the only one who can access it, and that is to go to the spreadsheet and click on the sharing settings here. Right now it's set as private so that only I can access it. I'm going to change that to anyone with the link. Now what that does is it actually makes the spreadsheet accessible to anyone in the whole world who has the link to the spreadsheet. That said, the spreadsheet itself has a really long, almost impossibly hard to decrypt URL here. So it's more or less virtually impossible that somebody's gonna, it's not virtually impossible, but it's very unlikely that somebody's gonna hack your spreadsheet and use your data nefariously. But it isn't 100% secure. Later on, hopefully I'll create another video that shows you how to make this a little bit more secure, but that requires a whole second layer of authentication. So we're going to go with this easier approach for right now that says anyone with the link, and I'm going to hit save. And done. Now if I open up another browser, and I'm going to need to grab that URL actually. So I'm going to grab this URL with the exec on the end, go to another browser and paste that in here. It's going to try to get me to log in. I'm going to log in with my other account here. And now that I'm logged in, I'm going to try and access that script again. And now it's asking for me to review the permissions. And it wants to know who I am on Google, it wants to use my email address, and again it's saying that it wants to manage my spreadsheets in Google Drive. It doesn't. It wants to grab information from the spreadsheet that we created. I'm not sure why that's unclear there, but at any rate, click Allow. And now I can see the scores for another user that is not the owner of that spreadsheet.